The Biden administration is reportedly weighing whether or not to remove some tariffs on Chinese imports to combat escalating inflation in the United States. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said some of the tariffs are harming American families and businesses, but not everyone is on board with this idea. Why the different opinions if the tariffs are believed to hurt U.S. interests? As the next U.S. midterm elections draws near, what's at stake? I'm pleased to be joined from Tel Aviv, Israel, by Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics at Tel Aviv campus, and from Bangkok, Thailand, by Jeffrey Towson, consultant and host of the Tech Strategy podcast. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, according to the latest data released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Producer Price Index, a measure used to indicate the wholesale inflation, increased 0.8% in May and almost 11% over the past year. That makes it 6 months in a row for a double-digit gain on PPI year on year. And data from last week shows the Consumer Price Index, which is another important gauge for inflation, has increased 8.6% year on year. That's a record high since the 1980s. So, Professor Jiang, let me go to you. As I mentioned, Janet Yellen said in June that some reductions of the tariffs may be warranted, that it could bring down prices. And we've also seen research from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. A 2 percentage point tariff equivalent reduction could deliver a one-time reduction of prices of 1.3 percentage points in inflation. So, but when the former President Donald Trump started the trade war, did his advisors foresee the impact of these tariffs on inflation?
Well, when these tariffs are imposed, it was designed to sort of used as a tool against the trade war against China. Now, the problem is that this boils down to who are actually paying these tariffs. And in economics, we have this notion of, the tax incidence in this case. In other words, the demand side or supply side. Typically, when the products are very demand inelastic, that means that consumers are less sensitive to the price increases. For example, for products that people are addicted to, like cigarettes, liquor, that kind of thing, usually the extra tax burden is borne by the demand side. In other words, the consumers are paying for it. Whereas when the demand is elastic, is quite elastic, the supply side bears some of the burden of the tax incidence. Now, in this case, it's very clear that exports from China are very much in demand in the United States. I mean, you look at the exports numbers over the last 2 years, particularly this year, it's been extremely strong. Last year, there was over $500 billion of Chinese exports to the United States. So I think there are several studies out there already that have demonstrated that the tax burden, the tariff burden, is actually shared by American consumers. On average, they're paying something like $400 to $700 per household on a yearly basis. So I think these taxes, these tariffs, should be gone a long time ago. It should be eliminated at the time that Biden's administration came to power. And I think at this point, it's already too little, too late. But I think it still helps. $400 to $700 a month on a yearly basis for an American household still means a lot. So I think we are really into a time that these tariffs should be gone.
Actually, the calculations may differ according to different institutions, because I've seen numbers such as even $1,000 a year for the average American household. But anyway, clearly the tariffs have not achieved its intended goals set in the first place, for instance, to bring jobs to America, to prevent so-called IP theft by China, or to reduce trade deficit. And yet, it seems that according to some recent polls, that 70%, for instance, an April poll by a Washington-based think tank shows that 70% of respondents indicated support for the tariff or the trade war, and that is this year. So, Mr. Towson, let me go to you. Why do you think there's still such a high support, if these numbers are correct, for the tariffs, for the trade war, which has not achieved its intended purposes?
I think there's probably two different things going on here at the same time, one of which the American public cares a lot about, the other which they don't really care that much about, even though they will have an opinion on it. Inflation is a huge deal. It is a massive issue in the United States. Everyone's getting hit every day. So that's a big part of what, this conversation is about. The other issue is the one about the tariffs in general, the relationship with China in general. And in that one, the public isn't really engaged in that. They're not going to vote on that. This is one where the government is really going to do what it wants. And that appears to be a larger story of a, let's call it realignment, rethinking of the relationship between the United States and China in the area of economics and trade across the board. And I think U.S. Trade Representative Tai has talked about that. So that's kind of a longer thing that's been going on. And I don't see that having changed in the last, since Biden took over. That position evolution of U.S. thinking hasn't really shifted significantly. However, the inflation issue, yeah, absolutely. That's the public cares. And I think we're going to see some action on that. I think the tariffs are probably going to be taken down to some degree because of that issue alone. It's pretty huge.
A recent study commissioned by the U.S.-China Business Council argues that the trade war reduced economic growth in the United States and cost the U.S. over 250,000 jobs. At the same time, trade with China and the trade deficit actually has hit record highs since the trade war began. So, Professor Gong, why would the U.S. government be unwilling to, or still weighing the pros and cons to lift some of the tariffs? What exactly are they hesitating? What exactly is holding them back?
Well, my reading of the news lately is because I think USTR Tai is sort of opposed to eliminating these tariffs. I think she is really thinking from her little perspective as a USTR, that is, using these tools to achieve these trade agenda goals. Which actually, doesn't have really an impact on Chinese government at all. I think initially, when the trade war was first started by the Trump administration, I think the Chinese government was very concerned about the reduced exports to the United States, the impact of jobs in China. Now we're starting to see that, on the demand side, it hasn't really changed much, other than consumers are paying higher prices. So there's less of an impact really on China's jobs on the production side here. So I think the government's position, or the attitude at least, has changed a little bit. It doesn't view these tariffs so much as impacting China's side too much. So I don't think these policies would be effective at all. So I think on this side, we're probably thinking that do whatever you want. We really don't care anymore. So. So I think that's a dilemma that the USTR Tai is getting into. So I think her thinking has to be changing a little bit. In other words, I think the tariff as a policy tool, actually in general as a policy tool, doesn't work too much, other than hurting economics on both sides, mostly in this case on the United States side, depending on what kind of exports China produces.
Yeah, the Trade Representative Ms. Tsai also said that the U.S. needs to keep the tariffs to have more leverage against China in trade negotiations. But previously, she's also talked about durable coexistence with China and says she aimed to reduce China-U.S. tensions. Mr. Towson, is she contradicting herself?
No, I think it's a funny combination of, when this began a couple of years ago under President Trump, it was about trade for about like 8 days. Trade, let's use tariffs, that was discussion. But very quickly it became clear that this was all about a lot more than trade. This was about technology transfer, long-term valuable technologies. And the tariffs were not being used on things like soybeans, they were used on things like technology. So there's a couple issues here going on at the same time, and tariffs just seem to be a tool that are used in things that are unrelated to trade, really. So I think you're hearing this sort of discussion of, look, there's a relationship that's being reset between the U.S. and China after 20 plus years. It involves trade for sure, It involves technology, which is a huge part of it. It involves media and information. There's a lot going on in this. And increasingly, we're seeing financial services and other banking issues coming into this. All of that is sort of being reset, and the go-to tool often is tariffs, even though maybe it's not so much about trade. And I think Trade Representative Tai has sort of spoken well in the sense of this is a larger realignment. It's long past about just trade in any set of goods. Secretary Yellen is much more talking about how does trade impact inflation right now. So that you kind of see the two stories overlapping.
Okay.
But I think we'll see tariffs continue as a tool regardless.
All right. Many thanks. We have to leave it there. John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics joining us from Tel Aviv, and Jeffrey Towson, consultant and host of Tech Strategy podcast.